Ezekiel 38 is particularly exciting because it has been being fulfilled for over 1,000 years. And what we're going to do in this class is take a very quick chronological run through Ezekiel 38 and see how phrase after phrase, section after section, word after word of this prophecy has been fulfilled down the centuries, and see just how much is left to be fulfilled in the future days. So let's go back. I have to click on that. Let's go back to 980 AD. A certain Vladimir, who became known as Vladimir the Great, became the prince of the Kievan Rus. I guess most of us have heard of the Kievan Rus recently with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and its attempts to take Kiev. And by 987, this Vladimir, who became known as Vladimir the Great, was ruling over Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the very territories that the modern Vladimir, Mr. Putin, wants to incorporate into his Russian Federation. Vladimir was born a pagan. He was baptized as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and he forced all the inhabitants of Kiev into the Dnieper River to be baptized. And he said, if you don't go into the river, you are the enemy of the prince. And there he is in the icon with a cross in his right hand. The world is going to become Christian. And if it doesn't want to be, the sword in my left hand will make sure it is. That was his philosophy. And incidentally, one of the well-attested meanings of Vladimir is ruler of the world. So let's forward now to 1640, where we find the French historian Samuel Bochart writing of Ezekiel 38, verse 2. Rus is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of the name of Russia. From the Rus and the Meshech that Ezekiel speaks of descended the Russians and the Muscovites. And he explains that Tobol is the metropolis of Siberia, lying eastward of the territory of Moscow. And he said that's been well known for a long time. In verse 15, we read, sorry, I'm moved to Ezekiel, yeah, back in Joshua. Verse 15, we read, thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts. And if you look on a map, that line comes from Jerusalem, and Moscow is almost due north of Israel and Jerusalem. Verse 8 says, after many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword. And the first Aliyah, the return of the Jews to the land, began in 1882. And here are some of the very early returnees with the primitive instruments and things that they took with them as they sought, in the words of Brother Thomas, to establish their commonwealth by agriculture and trade, although not yet under the protection of the British power. Over 500,000 of them emigrated in a series of Aliyahs from 1882, mainly from Europe, where they were persecuted. Verse 8 continues to speak of the land that is brought back from the sword. Jerusalem, as we well know, has been the scene of international conflict for centuries. But in 1918, General Allenby finally drove the Turk out of Palestine. Allenby is a fascinating character. The story of Allenby's appointment as general of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force is amazing. Underlines how the top military in the UK understood Bible prophecy, even to its chronology, in 1917, and sent Allenby out there to fulfill it. But again, that's another class. And there has been no big war in Israel since 1973. The land that is brought back from the sword. Verse 2, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. We've seen how Vladimir the Great was indeed the prince of Rosh. But in 1917, there occurred the Russian Revolution. The Tsar was overthrown and later shot by the Bolsheviks. And Russia was ruled by a Politburo, a committee of communists There was no one man at the top. But from about 1924 onwards, Joseph Stalin gradually got his hands on the levers of power until by 1937 or thereabouts, he was the sole ruler in Russia. And Mr. Putin is fulfilling exactly that role today. The Prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. In verse 18, we read, "It shall come to pass at the same time, when Gog shall come against the land of Israel." There are 6 references to Israel in Ezekiel 38. On May the 14th, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of a Jewish state to be known as the State of Israel. It had to be called the State of Israel because Bible prophecy, particularly Ezekiel 37, 38, 39, requires it to be so. And the angels brought it to pass exactly as God had predicted. And verse 8 also talks about the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. The mountains of Israel, that area in grey on the map, which is generally known as the West Bank, contains those mountains. And that wasn't part of Israel in the declaration of the state in 1948, but it was captured by the Israeli forces in 1967. And they are busy building settlements in that territory. Verse 5, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them. Seems a strange company. Russia, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya. There's Ethiopia in northeastern Africa, ruled by Haile Selassie, the emperor, until he was overthrown in 1974 by a communist revolution, which obviously put Ethiopia in the Russian camp. And in April 2019, the Russian and Ethiopian governments signed an agreement for Russia to build a nuclear reactor in Ethiopia. You only do that for your good friends. And what about Persia? Ruled by the Shah. The original Shah of Persia was put there by the British to make Persia a buffer state between Russia and India. And the Shah was very pro-Western. But in 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini fomented an Islamic revolt which overthrew the Shah. And again, you would think that's pretty extreme Shiite Islam wouldn't have relations with Russia, but it does. And there's Mr. Putin, sitting discussing things with Ayatollah Khamenei, who is currently the supreme spiritual ruler of Iran, under a photograph of Ayatollah Khamenei, the architect of the revolution. Verse 12. This host is going to come to take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited. And for decades, brethren have pondered, what is the spoil that Gog will come to take? In 2009, Israel discovered the Tamar gas field, brought it on stream 4 years later. And they've since discovered the Leviathan and other fields, vast quantities of gas under the Mediterranean Sea, and indeed oil under the land of Israel. 70% of Israel's electricity is now generated by gas-fired power stations. They're exporting gas to Egypt and to Jordan. And under the Abraham Accords, the United Arab Emirates is investing in Israel's offshore gas industry. They're talking about Israel being a major supplier of gas to Europe via Cyprus and Greece. Not news Mr. Putin wants to hear. So what about Russia? Verse 10. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, it shall come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. When the communist revolution took place in 1917, Lenin and Trotsky and the other communists, the Bolsheviks, weren't interested in attacking other territories and trying to make them communist also. What they were hoping to do was foment similar revolutions in those territories, so the people would rise up against their autocratic rulers and those nations would become communists. Didn't happen, of course. But now Russia is taking a very different attitude to surrounding territories. Invading Georgia in 2008, eastern Ukraine in 2014, and annexing Crimea at the same time, Syria in 2015. Russia is now sitting on Israel's northern border, ready to fulfill the latter part of Ezekiel 38 and the events of Ezekiel 39. I had a conversation with an Israeli soldier in the area of Galilee near Mount Hermon. I talked to him about Ezekiel 38, and I said to him, from your guard post up on Hermon, you can almost see the Russian soldiers. And this chapter says they're going to come over your border big time and invade Israel. Young lad, early 20s, he said, don't worry, we'll beat them, same as we've beaten everybody else that's come against us. They that are dwelling safely, in confidence, will look at the walls, bars, and gates in a bit. Verse 9, thou shalt ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands and many people with thee. Russia's got 72,000 paratroopers. They can drop men and material into enemy territory and be ready to go within minutes. Huge airborne capacity. They can cover Israel like a cloud if they so wish to do. And God says they will. Verse 13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all the young lions thereof shall say unto thee, art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey? So what about the merchants of Tarshish? We're getting really up to date now. We're talking 2018, only 4 years ago. Tarshish has long been identified, descended from Japheth, maritime power, located in the west, source of silver, iron, tin, and lead, a colonial power. But now, presence in the Persian Gulf. There is a part of HMS Jafar, which is a naval base in Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf. And that's where Britain bases its minesweepers, 2 of them there, which seek to keep that strategic waterway through which much of the world's oil flows clear of Iranian mines. Britain's first naval base east of Suez since 1971. Tarshish is back. Sheba and Dedan, this territory down the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. These nations were opposed to Israel in 1948 and 1967. Now they're signing up to the Abraham Accords. Amazing situation. Former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair was the EU's ambassador to the Middle East for 8 years. He accomplished nothing and he was hated by all parties. President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, within the space of a couple of years, had negotiated these deals with the Sunni Arabs in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and they signed the Abraham Accords. They're moving toward friendship with Israel. That's a 2018 headline from the Independent newspaper in the UK. And here's a statement from Moshe Yalon, who's a former Israel defense minister, showing that the very Arabs who were against them in the Six-Day War, trying to destroy the Jewish state, are in the same boat with a common enemy of a nuclear Iran. Things have moved, things have changed. The angels have been at work behind the scenes, fulfilling this prophecy. And we haven't finished yet with Tarshish. That's Tel Aviv. Verse 12 talks about the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the midst of the land. And that photograph we saw earlier of the 1882 immigrants They were sitting on that sort of coastline. And look what they've done with it now. It is, of course, Sin City, but it's a huge modern development. And then on the 31st of the 1st, 2020, Britain left the EU and gained freedom to do things which she had not been able to do before. And we're particularly interested in what she's doing in that region of Sheba and Dedan. The Arab nation of Oman has got a big coastline along the southern part of that Arabian Peninsula. It was totally undeveloped, and they decided they wanted to diversify from oil and do other things. And so they built, in 5 years, this huge port, Port Duqm. And the really interesting bit about Port Duqm is that it has, as part of its facilities, a massive dry dock, which is capable of taking the largest ships the Royal Navy has ever had, the 2 giant aircraft carriers. If they need repairs when they're in the region of the Persian Gulf, Britain has negotiated with the Omanis that they can use that dry dock. For years, Britain has had an overseas army base where they train army personnel. That base for years has been in Canada. It's been moved this year to Oman. And the rationale behind that move is the top British military authorities want the men and the material in an area where war might break out, not an ocean away, quote unquote. So we now have the situation where in that territory, Sheba and Dedan, Britain has HMS Jafir there in Bahrain at the top, the facility to use Port Duqm on the southern coast, and its major army training base in Oman. 3 significant military facilities in the territory of Sheba and Dedan. And that brings us right up to date, up to this year. So what's left that hasn't been fulfilled yet in Ezekiel 38? Well, it talks about a land of unwalled villages in verse 11. And there are still walls separating Israelis from Palestinians. But you will have noticed that through the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem and the signing of the Abraham Accords, all Donald Trump's doing, the Palestinians have been marginalized. Haven't got time to go into detail, but they're in a far, far weaker position now than they've ever been, moving in the right direction. And so verses 18 to 23 talk about the invasion of Gog and his allies and what God will do against them. Ezekiel 39 verses 1 to 5 tell us that they're going to fall upon the mountains of Israel, smitten by God's weapons, which man has no answer for. And Ezekiel 39 verses 11 to 12 tell us that God is going to bury Russia in Israel. That's where we are, brothers and sisters, in these exciting times in which we live. And God's going to make a covenant of peace with Israel, and the temple is going to be built, and the nations will know that Israel's God is Yahweh. So what conclusions can we draw from all this? Much of Ezekiel 38 has been fulfilled. Step by step over the centuries, the angels have been at work. Gives us hope and confidence that the rest of it will be. The nations have maneuvered, the angels have maneuvered the nations into the very positions which God determined that they should occupy at the time of the end. They're almost all there. And he has given us his scriptures so that we can understand what he's doing in the earth and have hope and confidence in his ongoing purpose. The Bible also tells us how we should be preparing ourselves for the fulfillment of the rest of Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, which we won't see with mortal eyes. Because, first of all, before that comes the judgment seat of Christ, of which Brother Nathan is now going to talk to us.